You've found the Backup Wrap-Up, your go-to podcast for all things backup, recovery, and cyber recovery. In this episode, we take a look at the use of artificial intelligence in backup. Can AI make your backup environment actually better? Prasanna Malaiyandi and I discuss AI and how it can help from possibly everything from scheduling backups to detecting ransomware. We talk about using it for deduplication, for capacity planning, and even helping you to write better disaster recovery plans. It's time to talk about AI and backups. Hope you enjoy it. By the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I've been passionate about backup and recovery for over 30 years, ever since I had to tell my boss that we had no backups of that really important database that we had just lost. I don't want that to happen to you, and that's why I do this podcast. On this podcast, we turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the show. Hi, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I have with me a guy who apparently doesn't know how to hold a coffee cup, Prasanna Malaiyandi. How's it going, Prasanna?
I'm good, Curtis. So I think we need to clarify a couple
things. Are you defending yourself?
Yes,
Are you going to try to defend your weirdness?
Yes, I think we have to talk about multiple things. First, in India, they don't typically use like a mug. They use like a stainless steel cup. Right? So if you're drinking hot beverages, you can only hold it from like the very... You saw it when we went to the Indian restaurant in San Diego, right?
Yeah.
So you have to hold it from the very top, otherwise you'll burn your hand.
Right.
And then most mugs, it just feels weird. Like I got chunky fingers, like sausages, right? And so like putting it inside the mug, like the handle part of the mug, I feel like, especially if it's like a curve, not like a straight, I feel like there's not enough stability there.
That's fascinating.
And so for people watching the video, who, by the way, we do publish a video on YouTube if you want to see our glorious faces and our expressions. But yeah, so when I hold a mug, I don't hold it like this through the handle.
Right.
I basically grab it either from the top or I hold it like on the side. And then, of course, the pinky's kind of supporting the bottom. But what's weird, though, is the pinky supporting the bottom thing. I know you've complained to me many times, but that's also how I hold my phone.
You end up covering your microphone.
I always hold the phone, and then my pinky's kind of on the bottom, and so it always blocks the microphone. So Curtis is always like, were you underwater? Did you swallow your phone? What's going on?
So regarding your defense from, how they do things in India, what part of India were you born in? Just remind me.
Yeah, I was born in not India, but but at home, right? So,
but yeah, you were raised by people born in India, and so you were taught.
So actually, I prefer. So even drinking water, I don't drink from a glass cup. I drink from a stainless steel cup.
Right. Which is, if you haven't spent any time around, Indians, you wouldn't know that. It's just that you use stainless steel for cups, for plates, right?
As Curtis knows when I'm loading the dishwasher, and he's like, what is that racket?
What is happening over there? Because everything's so noisy.
They last longer, and you don't have to worry about them breaking.
That's, I can't complain.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't get the whole here I am with 4 fingers in my mug. I'm just saying.
Okay, so now what if that mug was smaller and the handle was curved?
Well, then that's like a girly mug, and then you use 2 fingers like this.
But that doesn't feel like it gives you enough stability.
And yet I've never dropped a mug. I'm just saying.
No. It's not from dropping the mug. It's from like when when you're drinking it, it just feels like it's a little like, and you might like spill coffee all over you.
I just think you don't know how to hold a mug. But
our listeners are probably like, what are these people talking about? By the way, this is a new format starting in the new year. We are now going to just be talking about coffee and all the crazy things that Prasanna does.
Yeah, absolutely. Or maybe we might actually talk about some stuff. So I thought we've been seeing AI on the news a lot, right?
AI? I've never heard about it.
Yeah, you've never heard of it. Yeah. So artificial intelligence, and if you've been following the backup industry much, you probably saw a few announcements from your backup company, or maybe backup companies you're interested in, about the use of AI within backup. And so I thought we'd talk about that a little bit in this episode, and whether or not it has a use, right?
And just to clarify, I think when a lot of these backup vendors launched AI, they were using AI for not for the core product, right? So they were using AI for their support agent or to help answer questions, right? Which I think we all understand, we all know about, but I think in this episode, I think we should focus on the core part of backup.
Yeah, so let's talk just a little bit about what we mean when we say AI. There are different categories of AI, and there's machine learning, which is very closely. And honestly, I think I could describe the difference between machine learning and AI, but then there's something that changes, that messes me up when we talk about that. For those of you that actually really know what AI is and machine learning is, you're going to be offended by something I say during this episode. I'll just tell you that. But we're going to use the terms almost interchangeably, but they're not. But I do want to distinguish between what is referred to as generative AI, right? Yeah. Which is a large language model that is going to create things. It's not ex nihilo, right? It's not from nothing. It has to have been trained on a large data set. But those are the kinds of things that they're using, like you talked about there, for support models, right?
Yeah, and just as examples of large language models, you might have heard about Meta's Llama 3, Llama 4. There's ChatGPT, or OpenAI's, what is it? OPT?
What?
The actual model, the underlying model.
Oh, okay. I would have just said ChatGPT, because everybody knows what ChatGPT is, right? I mean, you've got Copilot,
GPT 4.0.
Yeah. So you've got Claude from Anthropic. There are a lot of people, confuse the company with the product, but these are the ones that are grabbing all the headlines, right? They're also writing large bodies of text. They're helping people to write books. They're helping people to do art. And there's a lot of
don't forget Gemini.
A lot of legal discussions around the use of things like the books that I've written as feeding into that. And we're not talking about that, right? We're not going to talk about, hey, ChatGPT, my restore didn't work. Can you recreate all my documents? It's not. It's not going to be anything like that. At least not yet. We're going to talk about how AI can be used to basically enhance the core functionality. I mean, you said this in way fewer words a few minutes ago, but basically how it could be used to make backups better.
Yeah. And I think a good chunk of this is really, like you said, more around machine learning models, right? Than these large language models.
Right. So the first section, we'll just talk about how potentially, this is just sort of thoughts out loud. I know that we have a lot of vendors that listen to the podcast. We are technically aimed at the people who actually use backup and recovery, but I know a lot of vendors use the podcast. So feel free to take this episode and run with it and do stuff. So I guess the first question would be, do we think that machine learning could be used to help just improve the efficiency of the backup process itself? What do you think about that?
Oh, 1,000%, 1,000,000,000%, Curtis. So I've never actually had to implement a backup system, but you've done tons of this, right? And how do you go about just planning your backup, right? How to back up an infrastructure, right? It's like, just walk us through that, right? And how many spreadsheets and all the rest that you have in order to try to optimize these.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, and the answer is going to depend greatly on the product that you're using, right? I can think of the traditional way is that you're going to create some kind of schedule, some kind of automatic backup schedule, and you're going to do again, traditionally, we'll do 3 categories here. Traditionally, you've got some full backups, and you're going to do some full backups every once in a while. And I was always a proponent, if you had to do full backups, I was always a proponent of doing those no more often than once a month. Yeah. Back in the days of tape, it was once a week because it really complicated the restore process. Yeah. But, doing it no more often than once a month, but depending on your backup product, you might be able to spread that out even over like 3 months. And then you also want to schedule, if your backup product is capable of doing it, you want to schedule a cumulative incremental, a differential, some products call it. And then, of course, the daily incremental, right? So spreading that all out. And this is just
for one application you're talking about, right?
Exactly. You're doing this per application, per server, and you're trying to load balance things out, because if you've properly designed your system, it's probably not capable of doing a full backup of your environment in one night, right? Because that would just be really expensive, and then the rest of the time it would go completely unused, right? So you buy it so that you size it so that it's big enough to do a full backup over time, and you're right that scheduling that out is problematic, right? And you definitely could use AI or ML to do that.
And even for the scheduling aspect, so we talked about the applications, and then you were talking about sort of that infrastructure piece, which is shared, and you now have to worry about it across all of these things. And I'm sure you had these bonkers spreadsheets that you were creating trying to do this. Did it stretch all the way to the moon and back, by the way?
Well, you know me. It wasn't even a spreadsheet. It was just it was a script, right? I would just script all this nonsense, right? But the bigger the environment, the more that doing it programmatically made sense, right? And by the way, even if you have a more modern backup tool that does incremental forever, there are many applications that won't let you do that, right? I think of like database backups still need to be done a full backup every so often, and you have to schedule these out, right?
And that's the second category, because I know you talked about 3 categories.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the 3 categories were, yes. Thank you. I'm glad I have you here sometimes, Yeah. So you have the old school full and incremental, which old school is still current school if we're talking about regular apps. Then there's the forever incremental type. And you do have to worry about scheduling those, but generally you just sort of tell them all to start at once, and then they queue, and then it's a lot simpler to do those. But then the final category are ones that actually, and I think the one that probably stands out the most here would be Rubrik, right? Rubrik doesn't let you schedule that stuff. You tell it what your RTO is and your RPO, and it just does the backups. I mean, in fact, there are people that complain that you cannot, at least last time I checked, you could not do a manually scheduled backup if you wanted to tell it when to do stuff. I think this is probably the first use of some sort of machine learning or artificial intelligence that I can think of with regards to scheduling.
Yeah, which I was also going to chime in. So the first 2 methods you talked about, right? You're kind of statically doing this up front, setting the schedules and hoping that forever that it will be good, right? You'll always be able to meet it. But say that there's an additional load or a server goes down or something else, right? There's no way to fine tune and adjust that. Right.
There is, but there's no way to automatically fine-tune it. Yeah.
Right. And so you're just like, okay, maybe it'll fail a couple times, and then I'll adjust the policies, and then I'll be fine. But right, versus something like an SLA based, which I actually have looked at rubrics in the past, and I find that very enticing, because really in the end you care about what's your RPO and RTO.
Yeah, no one cares if you can back up, they only care if you can restore.
Now the problem though is it's such a big paradigm shift for a lot of backup admins that it's very difficult to understand, because It's like when people move from on-premises to the cloud and they were concerned because they're like, I can't touch and feel my equipment, right? It's not something I could actually do. I think that's also the same challenges you get when you move from sort of schedule-based backups to sort of SLA-based backups.
Yeah, I like the idea a lot. I still, again, if I was running Rubrik, I would give people the ability to do a manual backup if they wanted to. But I do really like the idea of SLA driven backups because I like the idea of SLAs. We've talked about SLAs on here, and I like the idea of knowing the backups are being done often enough to meet my SLAs. I really like that idea.
The one thing I think that is useful with these sort of approaches is we've talked about the fact that like your environment doesn't stay static. Right. So as you're adding new workloads, as things are changing, you don't want to have to go recompute your entire spreadsheet, right? Or your script each and every single time. So it's nice to have sort of these models that can automatically help fine tune and optimize. So you're not wasting your time because it's more than likely that you're not going to get it right the first time if you manually try to reset some of these things.
Right.
And so having this automatic thing that constantly is adjusting just seems amazing.
Yeah, it does. And outside of Rubrik, I'm not aware of any tools that do that. But I think that this could certainly be a way where they could use AI to do that. Yeah. And I was thinking about, again, going back to, it's been a while since I've had to do this in a production environment, but the first thing that you have to find out is how big is everything, right? How big is everything from a database perspective, and how long does it take? Because there's all these different, and that's the thing that nobody knows, right? How big is your data center? And they're like, I don't know. And so like you have to do a full backup first before you have any idea. And not every server backs up at the same speed and all these different things. So yeah, it is a complicated process.
And you may not be able to back up everything at the same time because there might be different hours, right? That a server is sort of offline or has less load that you can actually do it.
Yeah, so having some sort of AI or ML figure that out sounds amazing, right? Another area where I think that this could help is very, very closely related, and that is, and some backup products do have this, and that is making sure that everything in my data center is backed up in some way, right? Usually where you see this is an integration with like VMware or AWS, et cetera, right? Basically, just connect to my entire, control panel, and then just look and make sure that everything is connected to some type of policy to back it up.
Or at least assign a default policy if anything is created. So at least everything is protected, even though it may not be protected with the right thing, but at least it's being protected and you don't have to worry about these gaps.
Exactly. And I think you do see this in a lot of backup products. Usually, again, it's with integration with big things like VMware, Hyper-V, AWS, et cetera.
Because you need the companies, those vendors, to actually provide the APIs to be able to do these sort of queries. And I think that's where there's kind of a little bit of a tension there, right?
Yeah. I mean, theoretically, you could scour the data center, right? Looking for new computers. Again, I know I mentioned this before, but back in the day, we did that, right? And back in the day, we did that with Visio. Yeah. There used to be a very expensive version of Visio that would just literally crawl your data center, and it used some very interesting technology. I forgot the name of this, but like Nmap does this, where what it does is it sends a malformed packet. It finds an IP address. It sends a malformed packet to that IP address to see how it responds, and different things respond in different ways. And that's how it.
That is crazy that they built that.
Yeah. And so you could theoretically do that, but agreed, it's much easier if you just have everything's going to be in VMware or AWS, and then just talk to AWS. Now, again, going to VMware and AWS, there can be multiple virtual data centers. There can be multiple AWS accounts. So you want to make sure that you have some way to do that. And I do like that idea. Huh?
Shadow IT.
Oh, yeah. Shadow IT bad, especially when it comes to backup, right? Again, I'll tell a story from back in the day. Was the time that someone came to me and they were DBAs, and they gave me a directory of a database they wanted me to restore, and it was in temp /TMP on an HP box. And for those who don't know, /TMP on an HP box, specifically HPUX, was in RAM. So when you rebooted it, temp went away. And this
wasn't it source code?
What?
Wasn't it source code repository?
It was source code. Yeah. And they were developing for months, like an entire team of developers developing source code of this new application in temp. And then we rebooted the server. and they came to me and asked me to restore it. And I was like, dude, we don't back up temp. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, and they're like, dude, this is really important. Like, heads are going to roll. And I'm like, yeah, not mine. Like, everybody knows we don't back up temp.
Yeah.
Except for you, apparently.
Oh, man.
So I'm just, it's really bad when you have a functioning system and then it's not being backed up. Again, another story. We used to have, we had a naming convention. Ours was very boring. It was HPDBSVA, right? HP Database Server A, and there was HPFS01, et cetera, right? And I remember I had this form that you had to fill out. This was an actual piece of paper. We did not have web pages, right? Yeah, I had this form to fill out, and you had to, and it said on there, simply filling out this form does not meet the requirement. You do not consider your system backed up until you have a signed form back from me, right? And then one day somebody handed me a form and it said like they wanted like me to back up HPDB SVM, right? And I go, M, that's interesting. The last server I remember hearing about was H. So that means there's an I, a J, a K, and an L out there somewhere.
That hasn't been backed up.
Yeah. So this idea of automatically detecting servers and applications sounds like a great idea. And also not just VMs, but also it would be really nice if it detected the type of VM. It said, this appears to be a SQL instance. Exactly. We should back it up with the default SQL policy. That would be great.
Yeah.
So in addition to making things more efficient, there are some other things we could do with AI that also would be interesting. What do you think is the first one?
No, so I think one of the ones, and we've talked about it so often, and vendors are starting to do this, it's around anomaly detection. And it could be used in various fashions. So one thing is like, hey, by the way, this server, all of a sudden, it's backing up 10 times what it normally does. Maybe this might indicate like a malware or ransomware on the system, right? Or, hey, I've noticed that there's a bunch of data that's starting to look like, based on entropy, that it's been encrypted. That doesn't look normal. Okay, maybe I should go investigate it. Right. So, or it could even be security things like, hey, you're logging in from a different place than normal as a backup admin. Is this the right thing or not?
Yeah. And also very closely related to the stuff you said before was are files where the file type based on the first few bytes of the file does not match the extension of the file. Yeah. So it says it's a .doc. But the first few bytes of the file show that it's an application, for example.
That's an interesting use case around the first few bytes, because that could detect things that are being encrypted or other things that don't make sense, or potentially even malware, right?
Yeah, it's something we do. My employer is S2 Data, and we do a lot of restores of old stuff. Where we're pulling data off of tape, often for e-discovery purposes and lawsuit purposes and investigation purposes. And one of the things that we do as we're pulling data, because we use a proprietary tool that we've written to restore data off of most backups rather than use the built-in tool for a lot of reasons. And this is one of them, is that we check the file type against the file contents. And it can also indicate subterfuge, right? It can indicate somebody trying to hide something. So anomaly detection, I think, is a really big one, right? Definitely that this is a looks like you've got ransomware, right? You need to solve that. That was probably the first big use of AI that I remember in the backup world. And I will say that if the way that you know that you have ransomware is that your backup product told you, something is wrong. But it can happen, right? Another one that that I'd bring up is data classification. Again, I think that this is probably a very simple one, but the idea of like looking at all the different data types and helping you to understand what is in your environment. This is not that new, but perhaps the AI use case could be helping you to identify trends.
Yeah.
In where the data is moving, where it's being created, where it's being changed, et cetera. And then, which is very closely related to my other idea, which is predictive analytics, right? Again, going back to, back in the day, one of the things I remember being the hardest to do is capacity prediction, predicting whether or not I have enough capacity to do my backups for the next 6 months.
And you know what makes it even harder?
What's that?
Deduplication.
It does. Dedupe makes it way harder.
So,
and you know what? AI, right? AI, ML could be used because it's smarter than I am, smarter than you are. It could actually understand the trends as to now. What? Let's talk about that. Not everybody might not understand why dedupe makes capacity management so difficult.
So let's talk about before we get to dedupe, let's talk about like traditional storage or tape, right? So you're doing a full backup. You know how big your database is. Therefore, okay, my full backup is going to take this much space. And with compression, maybe it's going to be 2x or half the space, right? Yeah. And then okay, my daily change rate is say 5%, and based on the total size, I know what that's going to be. And so if I'm doing weekly fulls, daily incrementals, I know how much storage I'm going to need for a week.
Yeah, right? and just as important, you also know how much storage when you delete
will be freed up.
The older backups, you know how much storage will be freed up, which is just if not even more important.
Yep. Now, the problem with deduplication is they talk about these great rates like 40x, 30x, 20x, take your pick, right? And that's all great if you're if a lot of your data is very similar. But it's hard to tell, is your data similar or not until you actually start doing it. So if you're trying to buy storage for, say, 3 years ahead of time and capacity plan, it becomes really difficult. And so you guess, right? You'll take a stab and maybe you look at some of your data and you're like, hey, these kind of look the same, but you don't know if that's right or not until you actually start backing it up. And like you said, Curtis, if you go delete your backup, you may not actually free up that space because it's been deduplicated against something else that you're still preserving.
Right.
So say I go delete my backup for 6 months ago for one application, another application might have common blocks with that data or with that other application. And so even though I deleted the first application's backup, it's not going to free up space. And so you end up with this problem and this challenge. And that's one of the hardest things about deduplication. Having worked at a company that did deduplication, customers always struggled with it.
Yeah.
Right? And some of the things we would do is we would be like, hey, let's scan your application and just understand what sort of dedupe rates you may get. And even that's a guess because maybe you move an application from one storage appliance to a different appliance, and now your dedupe rates are different.
Yeah, and again, one of the most frustrating things could be if you start, you're running out of capacity, right? And so you say, listen, I know we said we wanted to keep backups for 3 years, but we're running out of capacity, and so we're going to start deleting 3 years minus a month.
Yeah.
And you do that, and you get back 0.1%. Yep. It can be very difficult.
Or the fact that to free up that space takes time, because typically with a lot of these systems, there's a background process typically called garbage collection, which goes and now needs to free up all this data, and that does take time to run.
Yeah, it is a two-stage process where you flag that block for deletion, and then another process that runs. Typically when backups aren't running, and you'd probably have to force the garbage collection process.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
So I was just thinking as we were talking about the first time that I heard about AI in storage.
Okay.
And I think the first company that I can recall, and I'm sure there were others, was actually Nimble Storage.
Okay.
And Nimble, what they did is their first product when they built, they provided primary storage. And their first product, they basically were like, hey, we are optimized for SQL. We are optimized for VMware. We are optimized for these different. And I was like, oh, that's pretty awesome. They're doing it dynamically. But I think at the time, it was kind of a static thing where you would say, hey, I have VMware. I'm writing into this data store. And it would optimize and it would basically pick different block sizes for deduplication based on application.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I think going back to the thing we were talking about of like using AI to basically help me understand when do I need to order more storage. It can, to the best of its ability, it can actually look at all of the dedupe rates, right? At all of it could look at the dedupe rate of each individual backup, right? You told me there's a backup this much, and this is how much, and so we can actually run all those calculations, and I can actually figure out, well, in 6 months, based on if everything stays the same, in 6 months, you're going to be out of storage.
Which many vendors actually do.
Yeah.
Right.
So
because I think storage capacity is a little easier to predict. Because like you said, you're not really changing things, right? You know what your policy is. You know what data is coming in. You know how long you're keeping it. You know what your deduplication rates are. You know how much it's filling up. So I think it's a little easier than what we had talked about previously, where it's like, okay, now let me plan out my entire backup infrastructure and start scheduling that.
Yeah. Speaking of dedupe, can AI help dedupe itself? Do you think that?
So I think my biggest challenge would be that to run AI requires compute, and usually backup, you want to go as fast as you can. Right. And so I think there's that tension that exists between running as fast as you can versus introducing something in the pipeline that could potentially slow things down. And you'd have to also ask at what cost, right? Like, are you going to be saving, say, 70% additional versus a traditional algorithms, or is it going to be much less?
Yeah. I think dedupe in the backup world, there have been two main ways to do dedupe, which there has been something that isn't really dedupe, but there were dedupe products that called themselves dedupe products that did this, and that would be block level incremental, essentially, right? Not actually deduping things against each other, but just using technology to lower the additional new data that's backed up from each workload. But then the traditional dedupe, the way it works for those that don't know this, is that you slice everything up into what are typically called shards or chunks. You run some type of algorithm on it that gives you some type of thing like SHA-1 was the original, SHA-2, SHA-256. And again, here, the better the algorithm, the better the dedupe, but the better the algorithm, the more compute it takes, going back to your trade-off thing. And so that's the way, basically, every chunk gets run through. You come up with this alphanumeric string. That alphanumeric string is compared with every other alphanumeric string. And then that's how you identify redundant data. And one of the challenges you have with that method is that the data slides. And so if you don't slice the data at exactly the same spot, it's duplicate data, but you don't identify it. And there is a completely different way, which you look at the way VAST does things. They do something completely different, right? So they have an algorithm, and I'm guessing they use AI or ML to do this. They have an algorithm that basically identifies data that is probably redundant, right? So they've got two different ways to do dedupe. And so there are potentially AI or ML could be used to identify a new way to identify duplicate data that is maybe more efficient from a compute and storage. Like even if it was just more efficient from a compute standpoint, but got the same amount of dedupe, that would still be great. But potentially this is something that I think AI could help with.
And the one thing I did also want to comment on, Curtis, is going back to your comment about, okay, if the data shifts, then now you have to make sure that you're doing the right blocks, right? This is where companies, though, have done sort of what you're talking about is called fixed block deduplication, right? There are many vendors out there, though, who do variable size, right? Variable block deduplication, which allows it to vary such that if you do get an offset, right, because of some data change, it's still able to dedupe everything else after that because of how it's actually computing the chunks, the segments, right, each of the blocks.
Yeah. So that's certainly an area where AI could potentially help. The next, do you think it could help with recovery testing?
Oh yeah, I would. So one thing for certain is like most people probably don't know how to write a DR plan, right? I wonder if you took AI, like even, and going back to the first set, right? The large language models. Right.
Yeah. So the thing we said we weren't talking about, I think we're going to talk about it here. Yeah.
Yeah. I think at least to start with, it's like, hey, here's all my data. Here's my applications. Help me build a DR test plan.
Yeah. I like that idea.
And see what it pops out, because and it may not be perfect, and don't just blindly trust what it provides, but use it as a starting point, right? And then go use that, because I think a lot of people struggle with, where do I even start?
Yeah. And you could also, you could use it like a chaos monkey, right? Yeah. You could use it, help me come up with some interesting scenarios to just make the idea, one of the things that we talked about in terms of cyber testing was, when we had Mike on, the idea of like doing this and making it fun, making it a game. Yeah. I like that idea a lot. And I think maybe AI could help there. Yeah. If it helps you do recovery testing more often, and helps you identify potential plot. I was going to say plot holes. Yeah. Potential holes in your program. Then that I think could be very helpful.
Yeah. And Curtis, since you threw out a term, Chaos Monkey is a tool that was released by Netflix, and literally what it is used for is to just test IT resiliency. So it'll go randomly kill services, kill locations, kill network connections, just to see, is streaming interrupted? Are end users having any sort of issues? And it's able to do this at a scale and in an automated fashion versus someone like trying to think about all the combinations, permutations, and scenarios, because they're probably going to miss things. And so Netflix designed this thing to actually go out and test their infrastructure.
And it's pretty impressive. Their infrastructure in general is pretty impressive. It's not flawless. I did watch part of the Tyson fight a little while ago, and that was on Netflix, and it was not good, right? That wasn't so much a resilient thing as it was they could have used perhaps a little bit better AI to predict what kind of load they were going to have. But the idea of predicting crazy things that will happen, Netflix is pretty darn resilient when it comes to their infrastructure. So I like that idea a lot. And I think this is something that could be that again an LLM could actually help with, right? So like I said, the thing that we said we weren't going to talk about, we could talk about it, right? And for those, if you've never used a ChatGPT or a Claude, I think it's very useful here, right? You could say, hey, I'm this kind of company. This is the type of company, and I understand the privacy concerns of what you share with a ChatGPT or a Claude. There are on-prem versions that you can run of these LLMs too, so that you can keep the data to yourself. But you have a conversation with it. Here's the type of company I am. Here's the type of computing environment I have. What do you what could go wrong? Yeah. What could I build a DR scenario around?
Yeah.
Any final thoughts? Can you think of any other areas where we could use AI and backup?
Not so much. I think the one thing I do want to call out, though, is AI is here to stay. ML is here to stay. Don't be afraid of it. Use it, right, in the right ways, and don't be afraid, and just start thinking about it. The one other thing I will call out is, as companies are starting to dig into AI and ML for their own applications, production applications, and other things, as a backup admin, you need to start thinking about, how do I protect this, right? How do I back it up? How would I potentially restore it? Because there's a lot of data, and training these models is really, really expensive. And so you want to make sure you have mechanisms to protect the models that emerge from all of this training, so you can restore them if needed.
So use backup to make AI more resilient, while AI makes backup more resilient.
Exactly. I like that.
We'll call that a symbiosis. I like that a lot. What my final thought is that potentially you could use, again, going back to the thing we said we weren't going to talk about, you could use LLMs to help select vendors, right? You could say, hey, here are all my requirements, and here's all the documents that they gave me this 57-page response to my 10-page RFI. Can you help me make sense of it? You could use that. Again, trust but verify when using an LLM, for sure. All right. Well, thanks again, Prasanna, for a good chat.
Thank you, Curtis. And I am not going to change how I hold a coffee mug. I'm sorry.
I would expect no less. And thanks to our listeners. We'd be nothing without you. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.